Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Today our guest is the fabulously smart and talented Dr. Crista Miller, who is the Director of Music and Cathedral Organist at the Co-cathedral of the Sacred Heart in Houston. She's here to give some tips and tricks for the pianist that needs to learn how to play the organ. And she'll be teaching a course online this summer through St. Joseph's Seminary entitled Introduction to the Organ for the Pianist. The course will run from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. each day with a big break in the middle for practice, lunch, and some individual instruction with Dr. Miller. If you'd like to learn more about the class and sign up, go to our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com, and click on upcoming events. And remember that there's a 50% tuition discount for first-time students and church musicians. Thanks so much for joining me today, Crista.
You are welcome. It's my pleasure.
So perhaps as a way of introducing yourself to listeners who might not be familiar with you, your writing or playing, or your work at the Co-cathedral of the Sacred Heart in Houston, could you tell us a bit about the path your life took to get to the organ?
Sure. I had an early piano teacher who was also an organist, and her husband was a minister, so she was also a church musician. And so I started piano with her when I was quite young. And when I was about 12, she decided I should start taking the organ too. And like many pianists out there, my initial thinking even at that young age was, well, I already play one instrument. This is a lot harder to learn something new. So that wasn't initially so interesting to me, to be honest. But when I was 14, I began playing in a church, my home church at the time. And my confirmation sponsor actually mentored me and helped me learn how to play Mass, which is a little bit different than just playing an instrument. You know, you have to know a lot of cues, and she helped me with that. And then soon, even before I could drive, I had actually 3 churches that I played at on Sunday. So I played at my Catholic church, and then I went down the street to a service at an Episcopalian church, and then I drove, or my mom drove me actually, to another town where I played in a Presbyterian church. And that was a small enough church that if I was a little bit late, they would wait for me. And that church had a choir too, so I, suddenly also had to be accompanying, and so I learned a lot of skills even before I could drive, which is good. Fast forward to now, so I've been playing and have had a church job for over 30 years. I've been at the Co-cathedral of the Sacred Heart since 2004. At that time, we were in an old building, and since then we have built a much larger cathedral that seats 1,800, and I was responsible for putting in a really large and wonderful organ. It's the Opus 19 of Martin Pazzi. So it's a 4-manual pipe organ, 76 stops, really large. And you have to know also, Jenny, that in my career, those early churches that I mentioned, I played on 2 different Hammond organs. I've had a job in the past where I played on a 5-stop pipe organ. It was a marvelous acoustic, actually. That was a nice job. So, I've really played everything in my career. So to kind of be where I'm at currently is still a great blessing to me and something I'm really grateful for. So
yes, I'm sure it's thrilling to be able to play on such an amazing instrument and to still have had that experience of trying to come up with something that works on toasters of an organ is a great learning experience.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, sometimes, in teaching, I've said many times to different students that, well, when you're an organist, you really have to be able to make music on anything, even a pile of garbage cans. If you are a real musician, it won't really matter the instrument that you have. So, if you're on a 5-stop instrument and you can do something amazing with the 8-foot flute, you can always translate that to a large organ. So we always want to be thinking, first and foremost about musicality and expression. So it helps to have that background. Yes.
Yes. So speaking of your instrument, I'm sure it is incredibly thrilling to get to work with it every day. But I'm wondering if you could speak to what are the sounds and experiences that are perhaps most thrilling for you as an organist? When you sit down to practice, what are the most exciting things that you can hear on your Pazzi at the Co-cathedral? or on another organ that you're visiting? In other words, what is it about the sound world of the organ that you find so moving?
This is a really hard question to distill. So I think my answer, what I like the most about the sound of the organ is its variety. It's hard for me even to say what's my favorite stop on the Pazzi. I mentioned there are 76, and they're all beautiful in their own way. So I think, I can tell you some things I find thrilling. It's just hard to identify the most. I mean, I think certainly on that instrument, I really have a fondness for the sound of the German reeds and how they're very chocolatey and how they really support singing really well. I also really love the French reeds on that organ. They're a totally different character. They're very fiery and powerful. And of course, in a large room with a 5-second acoustic, that power is quite thrilling. But even when you look at individual stops like his 8-foot principle, organists often say that an 8-foot principle makes or breaks the instrument, and a good one, you can listen to all day and never be tired. So I think that, his 8-foot principles are beautiful. The 16-foot quintadena is a very unique sound that you don't hear on any other instrument, and I love that. So, really variety. And it's the same when you visit any instrument, I think. I think your job usually as the organist, particularly as a visitor, like a recitalist or just if you're substituting for someone, I think your job is to find who that instrument is, and what's the best sound on that instrument. Where does it reside? Maybe a good analogy is if you were auditioning a singer for your choir, if someone came in and said, I'm a baritone and my range is from low F to D above middle C, you would not just say, okay, and assign them. You want to listen to their voice. You want to hear the different ranges, the different colors in their voice. And then you might think also about, I think that this person will really resonate well sitting next to this other person. Or I think perhaps I want to hear this gentleman's falsetto and see if he might ever sing, countertenor. I think we treat individually people such that we listen and try to draw the best out of them. And I think that's a really good approach in organs as well. You see the stop list on paper, you might make some guesses about what it sounds like, but your guesses in person are often wrong. And so, you sit down and you listen, and then you listen to the stops in their various ranges as well. So not just, the range that you might play in, but, test the highest sounds, test the lowest sounds. Often in a well-made organ, each octave has a different character. So you might even consider playing things up or down the octave to get some sort of secret sounds, some secret treasure out of the instrument. So that variety is what I really love. I am never bored playing the organ.
Yeah. So some pianists who recognize that they need to learn to play the organ might feel intimidated even by what you're talking about. Maybe they don't even know the families of stops or anything, or they might be intimidated simply by the fact that they don't already know how to do the organ and they feel like they should because they've already been working as a music director or musician. And the thought of learning something new, especially as an adult, can be overwhelming. What might you say about the path others have taken to the organ, or from your own experience, that might address concerns like this?
I think that we need to let our overwhelm coexist with faith. I think everyone's overwhelmed in learning new things. I'm working on a piece right now that is not going well. And I'm also feeling overwhelmed by the timeline and the requirements. But I have learned, not because I feel this way, I don't even feel particularly faithful about it. I have just learned through experience that if I repeat things enough and break them into small tasks often enough, that it is going to, what I always say is this is going to make, this will make it. It is eventually going to happen. So I do the best, honestly, when I try not to avoid being overwhelmed, but to give those feelings of anxiety a space. I think of maybe sometimes sharing the bench, like, okay, anxiety gets to sit on the bench with me, but also sitting on the bench is a non-emotional commitment to repetition, to breaking things down. If I can't do a whole measure, maybe I can do beats 1 and beats 2. Sometimes I even practice beat by beat. Or I would say, as you're learning something new, you just go ahead and give yourself permission to do things really small. And I think this is actually where teachers can help us. A, they give us permission that it's okay to feel that way. And B, they remind us that feeling a certain way doesn't defeat you necessarily. And C, I think teachers often give us ideas about how we can break things down. It's always your own accomplishment. If you're studying with someone, it's not really the teacher's accomplishment. It's you doing the work. But it's sometimes nice to have a reminder of some strategies to break things apart. And just a reminder that, have faith. It is going to make eventually.
Yeah.
So.
A sort of patience with yourself. And, small successes often build up more easily into the bigger picture, rather than just getting bogged down by failures or thinking that we can't do it,
Yes. Well, and, most pianists, I think anyone that masters one instrument can probably master a second. There are a lot of similarities between the piano and the organ, and many organists continue piano practice for strength. There are some differences, but I think pianists have a lot of raw materials already in their hands. And, your hands are capable of learning a variety of different touches at the piano and approaches. And so, and you've got your musical mind. So a lot of music making is between, your two ears too. So I think, really all we're talking about in transferring between these two instruments, piano and organ, we're talking about changing your approach to the keyboard a little bit. So your hands will learn a different vocabulary, is what I'm looking for, and variety. In touches. And then you're learning to play with your feet, which I know it's intimidating, but if your hands and fingers if your pinky finger can learn how to do it, so can your leg muscles. It's really a lot in your legs. I feel like it's very possible. So I think it's fun sometimes to sort of show people that and get to experience people discovering that, oh, I didn't think I could do this, but I can. I often don't think I can do things. I really don't. Most organists, as we open up a score, we don't play and sight read, a trio sonata. Everyone has to practice. So Anyway, so that's my take on that. I think just letting your overwhelm exist with a commitment to do the work.
So let's break down the essentials that one needs to cover when transitioning from the piano to the organ. You've hinted at some of them already. And since you'll be teaching the Introduction to the Organ for Pianists course this summer at Dunwoody, could you tell us where you would start?
Yeah, so the organ repertoire is actually a little bit friendlier than maybe people would think. I think a great starting point is repertoire for manuals only. So that's things for just the hands. And so in the 17th century, a lot of organs in different countries didn't even have pedals. So there's a lot of repertoire that is just for hands. It's a great way to start learning different touches and can sound really good really quickly in the hands of someone that already plays the keyboard. So the thing to kind of remember about organs, I mentioned variety earlier. What an organ is really depended on the time period you're talking about and also the country you were talking about. Things used to be a lot less global, right? So there is repertoire from South Germany, England, Italy, Spain, and France in the 17th century, and none of those organs had pedals, or if they did in South Germany, they were very limited. It's really, when we think of organ today with these big pedal divisions, that's really a North German development. So anyway, so there's lots of repertoire that's just manuals only that you can sound good very quickly. And in teaching a class that's very short, like a week, I think what we want to do is think about how do you have some successes quickly, and how do you learn enough in a week that you can go and build on that on your own in a way that bears fruit. So I think 17th century manuals only pieces are everybody's friend.
What are some of the fundamental differences in the touch at an organ versus a piano?
So at the piano, the way we use our hands is very attack-based, right? So if we touch the note harder, if we use more force in the note, it gets louder. When you play the organ, either mechanical action or electric action, no matter how hard you hit the note, it's not going to have any variety in volume. So most of our expression at the organ comes from not the attack of the note, but the release of a note. So I have found that as pianists learn to play the organ, they start becoming much more attentive to their releases at both instruments, which can be an advantage. So that's a major difference. Because there's not volume control with your fingers, what we do instead is we make variety in what we call articulation. So, staccato at the piano is approached one way. We don't really play staccato at the organ unless it's for a specific effect, but we have an infinity of ways that we can release a note. We can be anywhere from legato to the point where two notes are blending together to very short and very big spaces of silence between the notes.
So moving from touch down to the feet, what are some basics that a pianist who's looking to transition to the organ should realize about involvement of the feet, perhaps at a mechanical or psychological level?
I think one needs to be very patient with yourself. I think the most important thing about playing in general, both the legs and feet, is that we want to approach it very relaxed. And that's something that often people immediately do is they get very tense, right? So, and I'll talk about this in the class a little bit about just kind of how to sit and how to use your large muscles to stay relaxed so that it's very easy to play the pedals. So that's, just like when you were playing the piano, if you had your hands very tense and your wrist was in a claw, and everything was very hard, that wouldn't be an ideal technique. It's the same way with our lower body too. So often we spend quite a bit of time trying to get people to relax. In terms of what a beginner does, we always want to start with a few pedal exercises to get the ankle working like it's never worked before, right? And you could right now as you're listening to this, you could even do a beginning exercise, and that is to just sit with your feet off the floor and do some circles with your ankles, draw some circles. That's always a really good way to kind of get your feet and those muscles awake, because we don't normally use the ankle that way. So there is that. But then also just to know that even though as we're working on scales and things and just basic pedal exercises in repertoire, a lot of the beginning repertoire has what we call pedal point, where you just hold one note down for a very long time. And it can sound very good. I mean, and a lot of very even advanced repertoire has sections of pedal point. So that beginning skill is used infinitely, as you progress through the repertoire. So most people can relax enough that they can play, pieces with easy pedal point initially.
Yeah, you make a great point about the relaxation of the lower muscles in the body. I found when I was first learning organ that as pianists, we're so used to using our body weight in a really healthy way and feeling really good at the piano. But sometimes when you're sitting at an organ bench and you're not putting all your weight down, for example, on your heels, because you can't, otherwise you'd play notes, or you have to put your legs somewhere else because it's not being used, that sometimes the lower body can feel really uncomfortable, and you develop sorts of bad habits just to stay upright on the piano. So what are some of those tips that you would give about the use of the hips or placement of the hips and use of the muscles in the lower body?
A couple of things come to mind immediately. Sometimes what I ask people to do, so that when you sit on an organ bench, you are not, as you mentioned, it's not like a piano bench where your feet are on the floor and that's where your grounding is, right? So you're kind of hanging on the bench a little bit. So two things I found that are helpful. One is as you're sitting on the bench or just listening at home and wanted to try this, you'd want to be in a tall chair. Imagine you're riding a bike and actually just start, I'm sitting at my organ bench and I'm doing this as we're talking, right? So just start pedaling like you're pedaling a bike. Everyone knows how to do that, right? And no one is tense as they're riding their bike. So that's an easy thing for your body to understand. So just think about riding a bike. And then as you're playing, if you sense any tension, I like to really think about, the quad muscles especially. They're a good tell for what my tension level is in my legs. So as I think about those, my quads, my hamstrings, if they feel tense, I might just go back to that riding a bike motion. I might do it a couple of times. Movement always kills tension, right? So if you have to move something, you can't hold tension in those muscles. So that's one thing, is the bicycle. The second thing that I do may seem a little strange, but it works. I really like a hard, straight edge in the bench. A lot of benches are curved. My bench at the Co-cathedral is actually curved also on one side, and I turn it around and use it backwards so that I can have the straight edge into my leg. The reason I do that is because it's a little uncomfortable if you're tense against it. But if you completely relax against it, it feels okay. It's a very awkward feeling, but I feel like that straight edge prevents me from holding my legs off the pedals. Whereas a curved edge, like more space underneath you, I think we start becoming unaware of what our body's doing. But I know that if I'm tense against that hard edge, it hurts a little. So that's just kind of a feedback loop for me a little bit using the bench.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So back to our topic of what a pianist needs to do to transition from piano to organ. Where do you start with registration?
Your ears. Everyone has those, right? Registration is a lifelong study, so it's not something to be afraid of. A good musician is studying registration forever. There are a couple of rules that you can memorize. You can be very detailed. I mentioned those countries a minute ago. All those different countries had different patterns. So there's a doctoral degree worth of information. But if you just need a really quick summary, there's 4 families of stops. There are principal stops, and this is kind of the organ sound that everyone associates with the organ. It's like the basic organ stop. There are flutes, which are exactly like the orchestral instrument. There are strings, same. And then there are what we call reeds. Even though I realize they might have other names in the orchestra, we say that trumpets and oboes and the like are reeds. And they're fairly easy to tell the difference. So, if you were just completely didn't know anything and you sat down to register, you could just draw stops and kind of listen and identify their quality that way.
So could you recommend some repertoire that might be particularly rewarding for the pianist making this transition? Perhaps things that allow the pianist to take advantage of a well-developed finger technique, but make the involvement of the feet less intimidating in playing something that, for example, might sound quite impressive as a postlude for a big feast day.
Yes. One of my very favorite things to play is the Taqaddas of Pachelbel. Everyone knows Pachelbel's canon, but Johann Pachelbel wrote a lot of repertoire that's really nice. The Taqaddas are nice because they usually are a little bit of counterpoint in the hands, like the hands might move in sixths or thirds, and they're over a pedal point. And what you do, you just register on a big, full sound, and it sounds really lovely. Besides those, there are a few books that I think are really nice compilation, especially for the beginner. There's a book called 80 Chorale Preludes, German Masters of the 17th and 18th Century. It's not a new book. It was published in 1951, but it is full of short pieces, many for manuals only, of music like I just was saying. Some things by Pachelbel, also Walzer, Zachow, some chorale tunes that you would recognize and that your people would recognize in the pews likely. And they're very masterable and quick learns, especially for someone that already can play. So I think that's a really good start. If you were playing for church and need repertoire constantly, I think another really good thing is a bi-monthly periodical called the Organist Companion. You can find these used on eBay, or you can go to Wayne Leopold Editions and get a year-long subscription for a pretty reasonable price, about $40. And there's a lot of repertoire out there like that, Jenny. I could do a list for you if you want me to put in the show notes later. There's a lot of repertoire for people that need to play in church a lot. If you're a church organist, you have to have a lot of repertoire, weekly. And I know there are many things on MSlip and things that are available in free editions because these older bits of music are in the public domain. But I like these compilations and I like books for the beginner because it tells you a lot of information about quality. It gives you composers' names that you might not otherwise know. You know what I mean? Like you might, open to something and learn a piece that you like, but you didn't know the composer's like how, but then you can go to IMSLIP and look that up and find other things that are similar. So I feel like because we're in the information age and there's so much available, sometimes it's worth the price to pay someone else to cull it for you initially.
Yeah, it's almost somewhat of the role of a teacher built into a publication. That's a great point.
Yes. Another one is a series called The Church Organist by Paul Thomas, also not new, but 3 volumes. And I think those are about $18 on Amazon. Those, I believe, have some fingerings. It is a little bit like having a teacher. I mean, I think probably the organ is a type of instrument that you learn to maintain and also play kind of in an apprentice system a little bit. But if you need some self-study or you need repertoire quickly for a church service, I think resources like these are helpful to build on later, like that you can build beyond what is in the books.
Right. So speaking of maintenance, one thing that pianists might feel a little bit intimidated by as well is having this organ that they're responsible for maintaining, and maybe they understand like the mechanics of maintaining a piano, but they don't really understand much about the mechanics of an organ. What sorts of questions should they be asking their organ technicians?
I think it's really a good idea to build a relationship with your organ tech, much like you might with your piano tuner. Like we typically tune the piano twice a year, right? And weather dependent. And I think it's very similar for the organ as well. The tuning of an instrument is often affected by temperature and humidity fluctuations in our buildings. And so your organ tech could help you develop set points, for example, for your temperature control in the winter and the summer. They might also, if humidity is an issue for you, they might also give you a range of humidity. In Houston, where I am right now, we want to keep the room a little drier. In New York, where you are, often in the winter, we want to keep the room a little wetter, and we put a humidifier in like a practice room with the organ. So depending on your locale and the instrument you have, an organ tech can advise you on those types of set points. One thing I like to do whenever our organ tech comes is I like to follow them a little bit as they tune. Some things that you can learn to tune on your own, like reeds. There are some reeds that are easier to tune than others, to touch up. I'm not a great tuner. I'm kind of terrible, actually. My hand is too heavy. I don't have a gentle enough hand. But your tech can kind of show you some little maintenance things that you can do on your own so that you don't have to call them as much. Tuning reeds is one, depending on what type of instrument you have and the little small persnickety problems that you might have with your instrument, they might be able to show you some Band-Aids. On my instrument, we have an interesting action on one of the manuals. And when we have summer or winter changes, the transition between those, sometimes the keys of that keyboard need to be tightened slightly or loosened slightly, depending. And I've kind of learned to do that from our organ tech. But that skill probably doesn't translate to a more traditional tracker instrument, and it doesn't translate at all to an EP instrument. So because I have a relationship with the techs, that's just a person you want to have a good relationship with and maybe follow them around as they do their work. It's usually that's usually worth giving up a couple of hours of your own work to do.
Right. So in a sort of wrap-up question, I'm wondering, in these days of everything being online, as your summer class will be, what are some of the advantages you see to offering organ instruction online? Certainly, you can point to many drawbacks, but there are some advantages. And what might students expect in their experience in a class like yours?
I think a main advantage with organ playing is, because I mentioned at the very beginning how every instrument is unique, and there's this great variety. Often where you take your lesson and practice are two different places. But that's not true online. The fact that the teacher can move, I could teach from my house, I could teach from the church or different organ altogether, just to kind of show the approach of what you do when you sit down to a different instrument. So I think like the demonstration is perhaps more advantageous online. And I also think it's an advantage to know a lot more about the student's instrument, So like if you and I just now were trying to do a lesson, we would probably talk about your instrument versus my instrument. And I would be able to have immediate feedback and see exactly what you were seeing as well, too, in terms of registration, in terms of things that I would try sitting at your instrument. So I actually had been, even before COVID, I have a person that occasionally I was teaching at a distance in a different city. So some of these things I think are pretty fun. It was always nice to see where he was practicing and to be able to help him more immediately. Like, I don't think this balances, for example.
Yeah, that's such a huge problem, just dealing with the acoustic of your instrument in the space that you are at.
Yes. I think also another advantage really in taking a group type lesson is that you can really learn from other people, even if you're not playing the same repertoire they are. So this format might be more a little bit like a master class. And I think that I mentioned these different countries from the 17th century. So I mentioned before South Germany, England, Italy, Spain, France. So if you are in a group situation where you're studying a South German piece, but your friend gets assigned a piece from John Stanley, voluntary from John Stanley, like even though you are not putting your hands on that piece, you're still hearing the registration, you're still, kind of hearing the application that you might be able to go do later. So I think that's also a really kind of nice feature of online. I think a third thing might be that normally I don't think in a group setting we would go over YouTube videos together, but I think there are a lot of resources online that you might not have thought of to do in a lesson format. But I think now, because everyone is connecting via Skype or Zoom, I think going over things together, recordings that you hear together and discussing them together, I think that's kind of we've been forced to do that. And I think that might actually be kind of a nice way to learn repertoire as well, but without actually having to produce the repertoire yourself. I mean, a week is a short time. Yeah. So like I said, you want to make sure that at the end of the week that you have installed some building blocks so that people can take them out and get a lot of mileage out of them after the class is over.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today, Crista. It's been really great to hear these tips and tricks and learn a little bit about your instrument and your work as well.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We've posted a link to the repertoire list that Dr. Miller mentioned in our show notes page, as well as a link to her bio so that you can learn more about her playing, teaching, and writing. Go to sacredmusicpodcast.com, click on episodes, and this is season 2, bonus episode 5. And be sure to check out our next regular episode coming this Sunday. It's a roundtable discussion about the vital role that music programs play in parish life. It was recorded last summer, but the topic seems all the more timely now as we look at how to maintain and build structures that welcome people back to the regular celebration of Mass as we move through these challenging times. Until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.